proceeds of this go into the Future Makers program. Let's talk about the cost of living, okay? Bei ya unga imepanda and all. And we're joined by the former governor of Laikipia County, the Honorable Derito Muriithi. Your Excellency, good morning. So you're still Your Excellency until once Excellency never stops.
No, it doesn't. Not in this country. Once you're Mheshimiwa, in fact...
You cannot bring him back now to Honorable. No.
Even if you are no longer elected, you're still Mheshimiwa. It stays. It's for life.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
In the House of Commons, one of the standing orders is that it shall be dishonorable for a member to refer to herself as honorable. So it's not up to you to say whether you are honorable or not. It is your peers judging you and your conduct to say
whether you are honorable,
whether you are or not. So it's quite bad form when you see most of us going around introducing themselves. I'm honorable so and so. How it's not up to you to say.
Actually, give us time. It's the novelty of it. When we've had a couple of centuries of Waheshimiwa, people will get to an even keel and then stop.
Forget
yes, but for now,
yeah.
No, let brothers and sisters bask.
So governors will introduce themselves. My Excellency.
Actually, no, they don't. That's the odd thing. They don't. They actually don't. They're just so and so.
I'm governor.
Yes, but members of parliament. I think, from what I have observed, what you imagine being a member of parliament is and what it actually becomes when you get there, it throws most people off balance.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Some colleagues of mine in the 10th parliament they were senior. There were three of them. They were quite senior in society and in business and so on, and they had come to parliament, and they were quite disappointed with the whole affair. First of all, because when you pass a motion, a motion is non-binding on government. So you can research and you bring a motion and you debate with a lot of passion. Like, for example, cost of living, that now, government must take action to bring down the cost of living. But it's non-binding. So, these gentlemen were asking me, what is it for then after all that effort and debate, and then government is not implementing what you have said? So we thought we would be helpful and created a committee on implementation that could follow government to say, the House made this resolution.
Yeah.
Do you commit to at least follow it through and so on? So they found it really, really disappointing that, the debate itself does not mean that that's what is going to happen in the Republic.
Well, let's welcome you to the conversation with the day's proverb. This week's proverbs are from Somalia.
Yes. We have been visiting the western part of this country, in the middle of Africa now. I determined the Horn of Africa would be a useful place to go to. Yes. Somalia has a very interesting history, really. One of those few countries that was under the colonial rule of two countries, Italy, and then Her Majesty's Kingdom, the UK.
Then it was her.
Yes, you are right. At that time it was his. You're absolutely correct. But it was hers for the longest time.
Yes.
So even the current his
is still hers.
The her hasn't quite gotten out of the system yet. Yes. But yes, I stand corrected and you're right. One man marries a woman. This is the proverb of the day. Another man marries troubles. It is a Somali proverb. I need to repeat this. From Somalia.
So the proverb.
Say again.
One man marries a woman. Another man marries troubles.
Eric, what do you think?
Wow. Nice through pass.
Hey. Wah.
I believe the words before CT were, let us welcome you to the show with today's program.
So now,
well, all right. Let me
welcome Eric.
Dodging. I mean, it's so interesting that that's the proverb today. Yesterday, I was giving a talk in Naivasha to men, and one of our an amazing CEO of an oil company, lady, was the speaker preceding me in talking to men about women. And, what does she want? You as a man, what should you be stepping up to, and so on. So I will interpret it in that context, given that recent conversation that was just yesterday, that, some marriages quite good, near bliss. Some marriages can be quite difficult. And so quite literally, one man
marries a wife.
Another one gets into quite a bit of trouble. Indeed.
Okay. Cost of living. One of the things that, is a big issue, even for Azimio, in the top leadership of Azimio. The protests, when you first started calling protests, you had issues. You were talking about opening the server. You're talking about looking back and reviewing the election, auditing the past election, the composition of the IEBC. And then the issue of the cost of living started emerging also as one of the issues that you're raising. Now, we've seen the protests that have taken place across the country the last couple of weeks. And Azimio says that one of the things that they are pushing for is the issue of the cost of living. There are people who keep arguing that, is Azimio out on the street? Are they calling us out on the streets really because of cost of living or because of everything else? And then they've noticed that cost of living is actually a pain point for us. So they also ride on the cost of living for us, riding on our pain. Do you think that the country's leadership, and by leadership I don't mean those who are in government now, I mean those who are in positions of leadership across the board, do they really understand when the people say that maisha imekuwa ngumu?
I would say half of them understand, appreciate. By half, you see, it's not like 50-50. I'm just saying a portion of leaders seem to me to understand and appreciate the cost of living. But also, and an even smaller portion, the relatedness of issues. I recall about 4 months ago, I was on this very program, this very platform, with a colleague from the government side. And at that time, we're talking about borrowing and what it means. Because at that point, if you recall, they had just tabled the month before the budget policy statement, and they were showing that they intended to increase the overall size of the budget. And because of that, they were going to have to tax people more, and they were also going to rely on the domestic market more. Yeah. And we were arguing at that time that, look, this is really quite the wrong trajectory, because people are having a hard time. Now, if you tax them more, it means they'll have an even harder time. And if you borrow a lot as government in the domestic market, you're going to squeeze the private sector out of it, both of which are terrible for the economy. And if you recall, our colleague from government was quite dismissive.
Dende Nyoro,
yes,
chairman of budget.
He was very, very dismissive about what we were explaining to him. But those are the facts. So a portion seemed to me, as Dr. Moridi, to understand that people are really hurting. An even smaller portion seemed to understand the relationship between issues, unless you understand that relationship, as government particularly, taking action becomes really difficult. And you might end up taking the wrong action, thinking you're solving, and making the problem worse.
Then there are those that say, if you look at the issue of the cost of living, it's not unique to Kenya.
No, it isn't.
There are many other parts of the globe where issue of the cost of living are actually being raised by the citizens in various countries.
Indeed.
What's the difference between Kenya and those other countries?
I would say the difference is the reaction of government, the reaction of the administration. Because, when I start with, look at the UK. In the UK, you've seen over the last 18 months, and I suspect you're going to see it now as winter approaches, you've seen over the last 18, 20 months, many protests. They have not turned violent. You've seen protests with tens of thousands of people. What are they arguing about in the UK? They say, look, the cost of gas, the cost of heating people's houses and whatever is really high, and many people can't afford it. When winter comes, people are going to die. But you don't see government, clobbering them. I think in well over 100 countries, there have been cost of living protests in the last year and a half. So our difference is that government or top leadership of government somehow have convinced themselves that cost of living is not an issue, and that therefore when people come out of the street, we have to be tough, we have to clobber them, and I think that's the big difference.
If we look at the protests that are taking place in different parts of the world, whether you want to talk about France, we looked at the northern parts of the continent, looked at other parts of Europe, would you say that the protests continue to keep the conversation relevant? It's not necessarily that governments, the French government, for example, with the riots that we saw after certain people were shot at, killed. It's not necessarily that government will wake up tomorrow and do something to change the problem, but that to keep the conversation simmering, the protests continue, so that you keep being a constant reminder to government that, look, man, this is an issue that we must keep speaking of. Would you say that that was the same kind of conversation that you would like translated into Kenya? Not necessarily that the government do something, because I think we're all on the same page that even if we protest from now until next year, if the prices of things are expensive, it may be difficult for government to turn that down like a tap tomorrow. But to keep the conversation relevant, to keep it simmering so that you remember that this is where we ought to be, would you say that the same thing is what you would like translated into Kenya?
No, I wouldn't. I somewhat disagree. You see, first and foremost, opposition is part of democratic practice.
Sure.
So you must, in fact, those countries that don't have opposition soon slide into dictatorship. So people opposing or going to the street to say, you, Mr. Government or Madam Government, this, that, or the other, that is what the conduct of democracy should be. Can government do something about the cost of living today and make a difference today? It can.
What can it do?
20 different things.
I was going to ask. Okay.
Maybe just
20 different things.
Yeah.
Thing number one that you can do, must do, you can give citizens direct support, which is what most governments, I wanted to say most good governments, but many governments have taken that path. That look, yes, the price of oil is high generally, globally. Most currencies are weak. So it makes the price even higher in domestic currencies.
Sure.
Therefore, I'll give you some relief in the short term.
What is that?
Like direct subsidy, for example,
Okay.
which we were doing here, and then the current regime decided to take that off the table.
Yeah.
You can, for example, allow duty-free import of food, okay, which the previous administration was doing. This administration said will continue to do, but created some other bottlenecks of licensing, which then creates, So you can provide direct subsidies. You can reduce taxes, particularly on imported food, but also taxes on direct expenditure by citizens. So the best example I would give you is VAT on fuel. Yeah, I mean, that's something you can decide this morning, and in the evening, the effect is already at the pump price. It's possible to do.
Let's look at this practically now in terms of numbers, because it comes down to a numbers game, doesn't it? That the cost of living, we're talking about these food prices having shot through the roof. All of these things happened when fuel was at 8% VAT.
Yes.
All of them. Food went through the roof, it was at 8% VAT. If you're giving that as the most practical example and saying, well, don't make it 16%.
Because
but
that
at
makes
8,
it...
Sure, but at 8%, it's
still
been
went
at
up.
8% for the last, I don't know how long, but food prices have skyrocketed, still at 8%. How would that have been different?
Please look at the composition of inflation in Kenya. You see, the escalation of cost of living in Muga and Derito type English is called inflation. Okay? What is inside there in inflation? What you will find, three main drivers. One is food. And food accounts for more than half of the upward pressure on in the basket of goods
Yeah.
is food.
Yes.
Fuel is about 25, 30%. Then all the other things that we buy account for the other 20%. If you look at the components of inflation. So yes, while fuel was at 8%, the price of food was still going up. Okay, why? For example, the main imports of food: wheat, rice, maize, edible oils. Wheat, for example, we import from Russia and Ukraine
Yes.
for the most part.
Yeah.
When they started fighting, prices went up
Yeah.
and so on.
For everybody.
For everybody.
Yeah.
Now, and this is the point really we need to distinguish and make clear to our listeners, that wheat prices going up is not something unique to Kenya. It is happening everywhere. The primary driver of it being the war in Ukraine. But the reaction and the actions of government is what differs. Okay? Now, if you dial down on wheat, for example, we import wheat, but it comes with a duty in it.
Yeah.
Usually 50, 60%. That is something government can do away with for the short term, or even indeed for the long term, because we only are able to produce about 10% of the wheat that we need. And because our wheat comes at a duty, it makes it more expensive. Because our wheat is more expensive, wheat bran is more expensive. And that's why you find eggs can come from Entebbe to Wangige market here outside Nairobi, and they are cheaper because the cost of feeds in Entebbe is cheaper. All of that, you will trace it back to the principal source, which is that we have a 60% duty on wheat. That is a decision we should take to remove. So there are plenty of, there is so much scope for government to take action, not the action of tear gassing you when you go on the street.
A lot that can be done.
There's a lot that can be done.
But just like you've said and you've acknowledged, the government has actually come in with duty-free importation, opened up a window for duty-free importation of grain, wheat, rice, maize.
Yes.
Right? Something that the Jubilee administration had not done. Even when they were talking about bringing in the UNGA subsidy, they were only opening short windows for importation of maize. Peter Munya, who's the immediate former agriculture minister and who's a leader of Azimio, will remind you this, that he did not actually do these things that we're talking about.
Well,
When the war in Ukraine started, what did Peter Munya do immediately?
Well,
Did
look,
he open
Eric, I mean, I know it's perhaps a good conversation to compare, say, this administration and the Jubilee administration and maybe the Kibaki administration before that, all the way to the colonial. You know, a mistake is a mistake, whether it is done by Ruto administration, Uhuru, Kibaki, or all the way back to Angoa Makeri, you know, so that the actions of the management of inflation.
Yeah.
Because we should ask, for example, what is government doing? The primary plank, the primary policy action is to increase interest rates. Why? Because of the conviction and the view that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods.
Yeah.
Now, that has not come with the Ruto administration. That was there in the Jubilee. It was still wrong when it was there in the Jubilee. It was there partly in the Kibaki administration. It was still wrong, and we argued very strongly. And for some time, we won the argument that even if you really increase interest rates, unless you deal with that wheat issue now we are debating here, the cost of food will still go up. So deal with that issue. Now, if even the agriculture ministers before, say, Munya, all the way back to whenever, if they did not take the right policy choice, it does not mean we should not take the right policy choice today.
That's very true.
Yeah.
My point here is, just going back to the original question, do our national leaders actually connect our pain with the cost of living with their decisions in policy and in politics? So, for instance, that's what I'm saying. If those who are in opposition today still see the way those who are in government see things, we don't have a feasible solution in the future.
Well,
Because those in Azimio, even if you give them the opportunity today, they'll come in and they'll tell us about, it was Ruto who was wrong by raising 8%, but then they'll not be able to bring it back to 8%.
Well, if they do that, then we should use the Kibaki phrase and say there will be bure kabisa. I mean, the point is this: there is plenty of, shall I say, empirical evidence, meaning data. We have lived this thing over the last 20 years, and surely we must have by now learned which policy works and which is not working. Yeah. And we must surely know, if we look at the last 20, 25 years, that raising interest rates as the primary way of managing the cost of living has not worked for us, and it has not worked for many countries. Now, raising interest rates is typically the IMF prescription. And what you will find, we spoke about the fact that these cost of living protests are all over the world. They seem to be larger, or perhaps more, what's the word I need to use here? More vigorous.
More vigorous, yeah.
In those places where this IMF medicine is being applied the most. Because it is not working, and it has not worked for us. If you look at the last 20 years or so, the period where things seemed to work is 2003 to about 2008. And the policy mix, the things we did then, or government did then, were actually quite different from what was done during Jubilee and what is being done now. My view, and I feel sad that the government side is saying cost of living is not something they want to discuss. Then perhaps there is no point of having any discussion at all, because it is the main issue, and it ought to be held in a manner that we truly debate and use data to see what has worked and what hasn't worked.
Ndugu, when you look at this matter that we're now discussing, and you explain it so simply so that it's actually very easy to understand, how then do we explain the fact that this simple thing cannot be implemented? And yet, the leadership we have now in our parliament and Senate is like with every electioneering cycle, we get more and more educated people who actually, in theory and on paper, ought to understand these issues. And yet, the practice is a complete divergence from this simple matter that we're talking about.
I mean, unfortunately, I really don't have an answer, because you are asking me to figure out what is happening with the psychology of leaders. I mean, the last debate, as I have recalled, the chair of budget sat here and dismissed every possible conversation we were trying to have, dismissing it as opposition, as handshake, as this, that, and the other. And unfortunately, that is the line you hear repeatedly from top leadership in government, that these problems were caused by so-and-so. These problems were caused because there was a handshake. These problems were caused... Look, inflation existed before handshake. And handshake came and went. And inflation is still here. If the key economic managers, both from a parliamentary point of view, so chair of budget, chair of finance, and so on, and from the executive side, so treasury CS, central bank governor, if those key economic managers don't get on with the thing, then we are in a lot of trouble.
Is it that they don't get on with the thing, or is it that there is a narrative that they are determined to put across? Because you get to a point where you're hearing the same thing over and over again when you talk with people in government. They're telling you the same thing.
My view, and I want to emphasize a personal view, because given I'm associated with Azimio, my personal view is that the top leadership in the country has a certain script they want to push along, and all the other now, people around them have to do the same. And you see, sometimes as a professional, to try and explain something in to push a narrative that is untrue can be quite difficult for many professionals. I mean, I saw one PS, he was trying to explain the housing levy, our good dear, and he's such a delightful guy ordinarily, but you could see he was really sweating because he's having to explain something that is incorrect.
You see, it begs, we're going on to a break here, but let me just mention that we can discuss it after the break. So, one, unfortunately, is then led to believe that if that is the narrative that is actually being put across so vehemently, then it is more of a diversionary tactic.
Of course it is.
You are being asked to look in one direction when something else is happening in another direction.
Of course it is.
We can now go into that break.
Let's take the break then.
Yes.
27 minutes to 9. Speaking about housing and affordable housing project across the country.
Yes.
Okay? How many constituencies are there in Laikipia County?
3.
There are 3. One of them is larger than the other 2 combined.
Indeed. Laikipia North is larger than East and West.
Combined.
Indeed.
Now, the government says it's going to have 290 housing projects. That means 1 in each constituency. Okay? And the only way for people to participate in this, that is owning a home in one of those affordable housing projects, is by registering on a Boma Yangu portal. This one is not a new one at the Ruto one. It started a long time ago in the Jubilee 1 and 2. Affordable housing project, bomayangu.go.ke. Please log on there, register, and once you register, you start saving. And when you get to 10% of the value of the house that you want, then you get into owning that home. And then you can start owning and paying. Rent to pay is one of the options that you have. bomayangu.go.ke.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Take the money. Who's gonna know?
KTN, welcome home.
Hello and welcome to our Africa TV show with Dr. Rasha Kelej.
It is about fashion and art with purpose. Number of child marriage will double by 2050.
Because the thought of it scares me. I want my daughter to, to be like you.
No to infertility stigma, yes to girls' education.
As we feed the brains of our little ones in school, the Standard newspaper takes pride in knowing that we are making a mark in the growth of their minds through the newspapers in education program that steers them in the right direction. And we are proud of it.
The teacher facilitates, the teacher guides the lesson, gives directions. The learner now becomes the central part of learning. So during that, you see when they benefit, the learner benefits more than when the teacher is the main presenter. So it actually benefits learners more. It exploits their potential, their learning skills, the communication, how they collaborate, how they assist one another, and how they create and innovate things here and there. It perfectly helps because, for example, like the NIE, we can give them a newspaper and tell them to read maybe page 14 and page 15. Then they do a summary of the story that is written there. So from the summary, it even provokes their thinking, some creativity. It makes learning fun in class. And when learners are given an opportunity to explore learning under any browsing in the internet without proper guidance, they tend to be predisposed to unnecessary and age-restricted sites. But NIE is perfect for their learning. So there's nothing negative that can interfere with their morals, their values. So I would recommend that as much as we talk of this print media, the audio visuals, NIE is very good for this kind of level of learning, the primary school and junior secondary school.
To adopt and sponsor a school class on the NIE program, it will only cost 14,400 shillings per term or 43,200 shillings per year. For more information, please contact Ronnie Ouma on 0720-809-823 or rouma@standardmedia.co.ke. Newspapers in education. Readers are leaders. KTN, welcome home.
Cost of living. There's a report that was produced by the Frederick Ebert Stiftung, that's Frederick Ebert Foundation, for 2022, dated around November 2022, and we discussed this with you as well, Mheshimiwa, earlier. It was talking about the global protests around the issue of the cost of living.
Indeed.
There was an unprecedented global wave of more than 12,500 protests about food, energy, and the rising cost of living in 2022. Can you imagine that? 12,500. And these were across the globe. The wave of protests signals a globalized economic failure to deliver the basic goods that people need at prices that they can afford. It also says that although triggered by the cost of living crisis, protests articulated political grievances, complaints against unaccountable or corrupt governments, often in collusion with economic elites. Protests about the rising cost of living may be providing space for and fueling a continuation of extremist or populist politics. And mass protests about energy access indicate the need for civic participation in energy policies. This is a global thing.
Indeed.
We're talking about now Niger. There was a coup last week in Niger.
Indeed.
And the leadership of Niger are now even calling on those who are in government, can you start accounting for all the money that you spent? The people are pouring out onto the streets, going against those who were in political leadership before the coup and saying, look, you really desecrated our economy and you must pay for it.
Indeed.
So this is, cost of living is a touchy issue. And if governments and those in leadership, like you said, those in leadership, even in parliament, if they don't get it, then they're in problems.
Look, and I mean, I really wish, I don't know what can touch, help, persuade people. Look, it's okay to blame opposition or do whatever you want, but democracy means opposition exists. Opposition, by definition, must highlight where you are failing. So you can't also fault opposition for highlighting that you, government, you are failing to bring the cost of living under control. So those who, including President Suluhu, President Obasanjo, and other global voices that are trying to say to the Kenyan government, for heaven's sake, please, I mean, can you take a breath and deal with the issues that are there? Otherwise, these issues can really become, as we say around the mountain, they can become elephant. And if you doubt it, ask the folks in Sri Lanka. Last year, a government was forced out of office by cost of living protests that became larger than life, and government was forced out of office.
Okay, so if we're saying now, because that is it, that is what is on the table, isn't it? And now there's all talk of talks. This is where we are right now.
Indeed.
That there are people who are brokering conversations. Let's sit down at the table and discuss. Then many a Kenyan would assume that folks who are sitting around the table to talk will be talking about how you can actually bring down the cost of living. It is not going to be about power sharing. It is not going to be about who can do what. It is not about who is going to be part of what. It actually should be a conversation of government is sitting at one end of the table, opposition is sitting at the other end, and we're talking about, guys, but nobody's going home until we figure out how to bring down the cost of living. That's what the conversation should be.
A one-point agenda.
A one-point agenda. That's what we're saying. All these other things
can take a backseat for now.
Doesn't matter. Because if truly it is the cost of living, and that I think is what Eric's question was, is it that everybody is everybody in tune with what is really going on? Because I keep asking, there are two sides to this conversation. the only side that is not at this conversation that matters most is the Kenyans. Those are the only people who are not in the conversation. So today, when conversations are being had about brokering peace, and Obasanjo comes to the country, and Suluhu comes to the country or doesn't come, or they're somewhere in the stratosphere, wherever they are, it had better be that nobody goes home until the cost of living issue is dealt with and nothing else.
First and foremost, I favor, as Director Mureithi, I favor a broader a broader
agenda.
Not agenda. It should not be opposition versus government. This is a conversation about Kenya.
So
and the economic management of Kenya. Thank you.
It should be a national conversation.
It should be a national conversation about the right policies for us to be followed by this administration and successive administration and so on. It should not be about, and it certainly should not be about power sharing in any way, form or shape. And that is a view that I hold both as an individual and a view that I've expressed in our own coalition. That this thing, it should not be. Now, if you look at the statement by the coalition yesterday, the coalition was again categorical. Our principal question is the cost of living. Granted, we have spoken about audit of the 2022 elections. We have spoken about bipartisan reform of IBC and so on. But our principal issue is cost of living. The response from government that came a couple of hours later was that cost of living is not something we want to discuss with you. We have taken sufficient measures to resolve cost of living. I mean, come on. So I favor more stakeholders on the table and a focused and deeper data-driven conversation about how we can manage this economy to the benefit of Kenyans.
Mheshimiwa, this is a subject matter that you understand well.
Yeah.
Because it's an area that you have participated in for a long time.
Indeed.
This bringing down cost of living and the consequent ramifications of it, what should it look like? Meaning, I as a mwananchi, how will I know cost of living has gone down?
Ultimately,
yes,
two things you will know like this. Your shilling, your shilling, your money that you have, you earn,
yes,
is it helping you get more or less? So you will feel it in your pocket. You will feel it when you go to the shop, when you go to the supermarket, when you go to the kiosk. Okay. Right now, you will be, what you're feeling is that every time you go, if you go with the 2,000 bob, the basket of things you are able to buy last year is way less than today.
Yeah.
Why is it less? It is less because the various things you buy, from cooking fat to soap to unga, their prices have gone up. Why are those prices going up? So if it is it is because the cost of maize has gone up, it's because the cost of wheat has gone up, and so on. It's because the cost of edible oils have gone up. And that is what the actions of government should solve.
So when government says that they have taken care of it, what would they need to have done to ensure that what you've just said is actually experienced?
Take oil. Meaning, when you go to buy petrol for your car or kerosene for whatever, what would they have done? Government would have, for example, reduced taxes, yeah, or in the very least held them constant instead of adding. Now, by adding 8% on the tax on that fuel, that has brought the cost per litre up by about 10 shillings. Now, if government wants that cost of the or price of a litre to go down by that 10 shillings, they can actually remove the 8% that they added onto it. Now, government did say earlier that they have done a deal to import oil without using dollars and so on.
They said many things about that.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't. We may not have enough time, but suffice it to say, we all know that that is a deal to make money, and it is not translating into, and we can
the
go
country
into
benefiting.
the country benefited. We can go into the details when we have an opportunity. Now, if you wanted the price of petroleum to go down even lower than it is, you can look at the per liter of fuel, the actual cost of landing it in Mombasa will be something like 60 shillings or so per liter.
Yeah.
All of these other monies is taxes and levies that government is putting. So if you want that to go down, then you can remove some of those levies or reduce them so that you bring down the cost of that per liter price. Now, of course, they will argue that, but we need these taxes in order to run government.
Yes.
Which means you have to go into, what are you using the money for? So let us look at the components of the budget and look at where can we save. So, for instance, when we were last with you here debating with Didi Nyoro, and I was arguing that why do you need to increase the budget first of all?
Yeah.
Why can't you stay where it was last year, or even better, reduce it? Because in these 20 years that I'm talking about, for 4 years, we had a nearly balanced budget.
Yes.
And that is why the economy was working. 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006.
Yes.
In 2004, we actually had a budget surplus of 1 billion.
Yes, we did.
And because of that, government was not out borrowing all the money, for example. That forced the banks to come and look for you and me and other Kenyans to lend them so that economic activity can take place. So the decision to increase the budget is at the heart of the problem.
It automatically increases the
cost of
need,
living.
The need to raise the money to finance that budget.
Yes.
And that's why I feel, Mheshimiwa, that I hear you and I hear you very well.
Yes.
But your colleagues in the Azimio coalition are not as clear-minded as you, or they're not at least as honest as you are. Because those who sat in Parliament looked at the budget policy statement, they could see indications that the government wants to spend more. They looked at the estimates. They could clearly now see that the government says it's going to spend more. They approved the estimates. Once you've told the government, go and spend 3.6 trillion shillings, what do you expect it to do? The next thing it's going to come and tell you how it's going to finance that. Indeed. If you did not raise those questions then, and you allowed them to spend 3.6 trillion shillings, how are you going to tell them, no, you cannot raise money that will cover 3.6 trillion shillings?
And it may sound like a basic, almost stupid question. Or did they not know that you're giving the approval to spend that money in a year meant that they had to find it from somewhere? Did they not know that their participation in this would then give rise to the next? Did they not know?
To be fair to the opposition, the opposition first called for protests back in March, immediately after the budget policy statement was tabled. And why? Because it was clear, because remember, the way the budget, and you're quite right, the way the budget is prepared, it's not an instantaneous thing. It's a process going over 12, 11 months.
Yes.
The budget for 2024-25, the preparation is beginning now.
Yes.
In another 30 days, the minister is going to issue a circular that sets the ball in motion.
Yep.
So that by the time you table the budget policy statement in February, most things are beginning to crystallize.
Sure.
You already, so like, for example, now the budget policy statement approved in February shows that even next year, we can expect another tax increase of about 400 billion.
Exactly.
And that in 2025, we can also expect, that's actually what is in the midterm, so-called midterm expenditure framework.
Yeah.
That's the projection.
Yes.
Now, so next year, we should not really be coming back to say, oh, why are you increasing tax? I mean, they have said it already today. So if we want to change it, we need to change it today.
So
is
the
it
members
that
of Azimio,
So please,
15-member committee, Budget and Appropriations Committee, right? It received the budget policy statement. It looked at it, took it as a report to the House. 7 members of Azimio voted yes to it. Nobody voted no, at least. When it came to the estimates, the Azimio leadership did not say no to it. So even if you're going around the country and you're raising issue about cost of living, but your members, you're not whipping them to actually vote no to approving the budget, you're playing us.
We first of all, your statement is not completely correct. If you look at each step of the budget, members of Azimio, in the various committees involved in that process, members of Azimio have been voting no. Not all the time, I agree with you, but members of Azimio has been voting no. If you look at the debates, members of Azimio have been voting no. But now it goes back to a bigger question. Remember this issue of the opposition and why government was really pulling every stop in order to co-opt members of the opposition to be voting with the government side. That's what it was about. Now, it goes now all the way back to the construction of democracy and the constitution. Now, the reason you need a strong opposition is so that it can say no when a no needs to be said. What is government's response? To co-opt, to buy out. How they have managed to do it, I don't know, we can only guess.
But Mheshimiwa, how then do we blame the government for applying whatever tactics it can apply to strengthening its position? Because that's what it's doing, while weakening the opposition. Why aren't the opposition strong enough to retain their membership and continue with the strength which they began with? If you ask me if we are going to now play this little game of apportioning blame, if we apportion blame to the government for pillaging, we apportion adequate blame to the opposition for not ring-fencing their strength.
And as a citizen of Kenya, this is why I join those who are saying, let us exercise Article 1 of the Constitution. Let us take back our sovereignty from this political elite, whichever side it might be in, because once we have elected them, but they are not, they're not giving fidelity to why we elected them. That is why, for example, myself, I've been arguing that all of those in opposition who have defected, we must apply the law and good democratic practice, which actually requires them to resign and go back and face by-elections. Yeah. Now, we have been defeated on that push. Yeah. But we continue to fight it.
How so, Mheshimiwa? The law is still applicable.
The law is still applicable.
The political parties is still applicable.
Yes.
If you associate yourself with another party, then you should. Now, I have not seen Azimio or Azimio leadership even going to court to petition that this action be taken. So the speaker is forced to issue writs.
Actually, there's a court case, as you know, has been going on for almost 3 months now. And the primary prayers are those ones that these individuals, these political parties have defected, and here is the evidence that they have defected. Could the court kindly issue orders for the speaker to issue writs to declare the seats vacant? So there's a court case already proceeding like that. The fight back from the government side has been, for example, in the case of Jubilee, to instigate civil war, if you will, inside Jubilee. So that now, because the process, fair administration of justice. If I say, Eric, you have defected from our party, we have to take you to internal dispute mechanism first.
Yes.
Then, if you are dissatisfied, you will go to the political parties tribunal and onwards to the higher courts.
Yes.
Now, if I disorganize the dispute resolution mechanism internally, it makes it harder for the subsequent steps
to move on.
And that I hear Muga and I accept that we in opposition, we ought to do a better job managing our shop. But I think I would be remiss if I don't accept the truth that the regime has been quite successful at creating commotion inside our political parties so that
there's
we are
no
not able.
commotion inside ODM. And their internal dispute mechanism
is proceeding as we speak.
Slowly.
Very slowly.
It's proceeding as
but
well.
it's there.
Terito, where are we going?
I hope the proverb perhaps for another day
So
ought to be Mr. Muga, that ihenya ria muthe ni kwegea. And
Translate so that I understand.
that the speed of an elder is
Probably.
mosmos. Yes.
The way he walks.
Is,
So until then, at least those in ODM should not talk about the regime raiding. If you still haven't finished your own first step of show cause, surely.
well, those steps are proceeding, and as I've already said, there is a larger case already in the High Court, and those are the issues to be canvassed in order that we hold people to account for. And we must give fidelity to the Constitution. The way you are elected, now, if you want to defect, that's fine.
Yeah.
But follow the law.
Follow the
Mr.
law.
When you come back, I will want to ask you this question. What happens if we decide to ignore the IMF and its dictates? But don't answer it. Just think about it, because
You can answer in a minute.
Nothing happens. I mean, we did so in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2000, and we were very successful. And that is why we were successful.
Okay. Really, yeah?
Yes, and I was in IFC. I mean, I was
You were
in
part
the
of the
Bretton Woods.
Bretton
I
Woods.
was, well, we were arguing then there, but Kibaki was able to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do what you're saying. I'm going to balance my budget. And that's the way he did it.
Okay. Asante sana. The Honorable, His Excellency.
the Honorable Excellency.
Oh, my
Excellent, honorable.
I'll be quite happy with Derito Moreithi. Thank you.
Derito Moreithi is the former governor of Laikipia. He's finance and what expert? There have many things
No, just finance and economics.
those ones, those two. He's been our guest this morning. Keep it here for more conversations. In the next hour, we talk about something that Derito Moreithi has touched on, our democracy. Is it in safe hands? And we'll be joined by Professor PLO Lumumba. Keep it here for that coming up. Have you signed up for Boma Yangu? You should just do that by dialing star 832 hash. Star 832 hash. Good morning, 9 a.m.